Hi folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we take a look at movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to do something different, a retrospective look at an album that came out earlier this year, Amok by Atoms for Peace. Now, as a music critic, you always end up missing albums. Yeah, even the guys who listen to a new album every single day are going to miss a few that are just outside of their preferred genre, or were dismissed out of hand as outright being crap. Now, if you're familiar with any of my reviews, I like to give everything that passes my eyes a reasonably fair shake. But as somebody with a full-time job and an active social life, I still don't have time to get through everything. And that means, like most music critics in the middle of the summer, I took a bit of time in this brief lull to start locating the albums in my backlog that I should cover before the end of the year. Sure, I'm not going to find everything, but it can't hurt to go through the 7 or 8 albums with positive critical press that I inevitably missed. And completely unsurprisingly, most of these albums that I'll be talking about today and over the next couple of while, with the exception of new releases obviously, are going to be the critically acclaimed material that Pitchfork and the majority of the entertainment press have all slobbered over. And those of you who have been following any of my work know that I tend to be significantly tougher on indie rock and electronica than most, something I also won't apologize for in any way. If these are going to be the acts that might dictate the paradigm of independent music, you bet I'm going to be scrutinizing them with a critical eye. After all, if you want to be on the cutting edge, you have to earn it. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the debut album of Atoms for Peace, a collaboration act featuring Thom Yorke of Radiohead, Red Hot Chili Peppers bassist Flea, Joey Waronker, and longtime Radiohead producer Nigel Godrich. From that lineup alone, one can have high expectations. That's the sort of superstar tag team you'd expect to be introduced with its own theme music. And while I'm definitely not the biggest Radiohead fan, it's hard not to look at the rest of this act with a fair amount of awe and wonder. But then, the part of my brain that leaps up whenever I get excited about new prospects made sure to say, now hang on a minute. You remember what happened with Angels and Airwaves, and even though Audioslave was a relative success, it was nowhere near close to the sum of its parts. And really, outside of Arion, there hasn't been a collaboration effort that I can think of immediately off the top of my head that hasn't either been overshadowed by one member or significantly less than the sum of its potential. And given some of my distaste for Thom Yorke, I wasn't entirely sure I was going to enjoy this album with the very un-Radiohead-esque title Amok. Well, did that opinion last? Unfortunately, it did. And while I wouldn't precisely say that Amok is a bad album, it's certainly a lot less than the sum of its parts, and encapsulates many of the reasons why I've never been the biggest fan of Thom Yorke or Radiohead, who brings some of the worst tendencies of both to this album. Now I should explain. As I've mentioned in the past, Radiohead has always been a band I've liked but never really quite loved. Don't get me wrong, the band has a unique sound driven by constant innovation, their instrumentation is damn near flawless, and occasionally they've written very literate, very intelligent songs. But yet, no matter how hard I try, I just don't like Thom Yorke's voice. Yes, he's a very pretty falsetto, and it often matches the tone of Radiohead's material, but there's an element in his delivery that just feels nasal and a bit too whiny for my taste. And this definitely becomes a problem when he chooses to sing self-obsessed material when said qualities in his voice can become very insufferable very quickly. On top of that, Yorke's lack of enunciation definitely gets on my nerves, and too often I find myself wondering whether or not his slurred delivery is just intended to make his lyrics incomprehensible so we don't spot the flaws in his songwriting. But those are technical complaints. My bigger issue is that as Radiohead's music has become more and more electronic, Yorke's voice often becomes the link to the humanity, the element that we're expected to connect with, in comparison with more carefully constructed songs, more mechanical songs. And oftentimes, I'm stuck wondering whether Yorke is actively trying to divorce himself from humanity and thus excuse some of the petulance in his material, or whether he's trying to get us to empathize through that solitary human connection. And really, most of the time, I don't buy into either one of those possibilities, and thus I've always felt that there's a certain emotional distance I have from Radiohead's material. On that subject, that's also why I tend to stick with the belief that their earlier albums are significantly stronger than their more electronica-driven work, because the more organic instrumentation doesn't work at cross purposes to Yorke's delivery, but instead supplements it. And going into Amok, knowing the musicians that Yorke had recruited, I was looking forward to a return that had a more organic, looser sound. And I didn't get that. This album doesn't sound so much played as constructed, with drum machines and tight formulaic rhythms, with any hint of organic instrumentation buried behind production and looping. If anything, it feels like a Thom Yorke solo album, and if I'm being explicitly honest, I'm a little upset with that. It feels damn near critical to squander talent like this in making something that sounds like it could have been done entirely on a computer. Now, I'm not going to deny that there's an intricacy and precision in the construction of this album that I can appreciate. But without that human element, a human element I reckon veteran producer Nigel Godrich could have incorporated well, I can't help but feel all the more distant from it. And remember how I mentioned earlier how Thom Yorke had attempted to be that human connection on Radiohead's more electronic albums, and how I was never much of a fan of it? Well, that feeling's only amplified here, both in Yorke's muddled delivery and lyrical content. I understand that vocals have never been the most important part of a Thom Yorke musical project, but I can't help but feel that there's something seriously wrong if I have to print out the lyrics sitting in front of me while I listen to the album to understand them. Not to catch words I might have missed, but just basic understanding. Yorke's falsetto is very pretty, I get that, but if I can't understand what he's singing, how on earth can I build an emotional attachment to it, or for the music and the ideas he's trying to convey? This isn't like with the Flaming Lips, who were explicitly trying to alienate on the Terror, or like what Kanye West, who used autotune to emphasize his isolation from humanity. Here, if I'm going to be honest, it just seems shoddy. And while it fits the musical aesthetic, I won't deny that, it doesn't add to it in the slightest. So what about those lyrics? Surely they contain some great poetry or interesting concepts to provide enough justification for why Thom Yorke is wasting talent like this, don't they? Well, after reading through all the lyrics and re-listening through all the songs, I did discover something of a common theme: troubled or broken relationships. No, seriously, that's it. Atoms for Peace Amok is just another breakup album, and frankly, I don't think it's a very good one. I'll give them some points for occasional bits of nuance and variety in the framing of said relationships, but immediately I have to take those points away for some truly self-obsessed lyrics. There's very little grief or emotion in Yorke's delivery to suggest that he cared for any of the relationships that actually failed. In fact, if I'm going to be honest, the tone of his delivery and that of the lyrics makes it come across like he believes he's the innocent one in all of this, and that he's not at fault, and that she'll be the one to suffer the ugly consequences of breaking up with him. It's almost no surprise the delivery is intentionally difficult to understand, or the instrumentation is so rigidly mechanical. They both now seem like defense mechanisms designed to obscure just how arrogant and self-absorbed Yorke really is. Now, let me be fair here. There's nothing wrong with showing this kind of portrayal as an artist. Hell, I can think of plenty of acts who cast their main singer as the villain or the asshole in the story. Nick Cave does this all the time, so does Eminem. But the problem with Amok isn't the content, but how it's framed. Instead of seeing someone who is aware of his flaws, or might be aware he's part of the problem, there's a distressing amount of myopic delusion here, where Yorke seems completely unaware that he comes across as a self-righteous jerk who always plays the victim. Now let's compare this to Gaucher, somebody that I used to know. A song that starts by doing many of the same things that Atoms for Peace does, but then undercuts that insufferable feeling by having Kimbra come in and give Gaucher a well-deserved kick in the balls. That's showing some actual nuance, actually showing the narrator to have some additional context and texture. But Amok doesn't have this, not to any effective degree. There isn't that moment of nuance. Hell, there isn't even that much of a crescendo to any revelatory turns. This isn't a slow burn like Nick Cave in The Bad Seasons Push the Sky Away. It's a static clump that never evolves or builds to much of anything. A very well-produced, very intricately constructed static clump, but nothing that raises a response from me, other than absolute distaste. And frankly, considering the talent that was brought in, it's disappointing. I expected more from this, and it's disappointing that it didn't come together. So in short, I guess I could only recommend Amok by Atoms for Peace if you're a seriously hardcore radio fan, and a Thom Yorke fan in particular. If you're a fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, I say you shouldn't even bother. As I mentioned, I can definitely see why the intricate electronic construction appeals to some, but without that human element that shows nuance or any attempt to connect with the rest of the world, I find myself very distant from this album. And in comparison to Daft Punk, who are distinctly electronic act only, and yet have managed to make very human and very emotionally evocative albums that did indeed speak to me, Atoms for Pieces Amok just falls flat. Thanks for watching. I'm going to be doing a few more of these retrospective reviews. Coming up next will be the Knife's new album. And I'll see you guys next time. Make sure to like and subscribe.